IPP, the never-ending sentence. So what is IPP? IPP stands for Indefinite Imprisonment for Public Protection, and it was introduced in 2005 by Lord Blunket. David Blunket created the IPP in 2005, and it was intended for people considered dangerous, and it was for people that didn't merit a life sentence but were deemed dangerous enough to have this sentence. So altogether there was 8,711 IPPs given out, and initially it was made, well, supposedly it was meant to be for just 1,000, but the judges gave it out too often and created chaos in the prison system. 249 of these IPPs were given to women, 326 were given to children, and some of them were as young as 12-year-old that were given IPP. Between the ages of 12 and 14, 16 young boys were given IPP. This IPP is the same as a life sentence. You get given a tariff and you have to serve that before you apply for parole. This is the minimum amount of time. So if you got given a 2-year IPP, you had to serve 2 years before you were considered for parole. But in that time, you were supposed to, or you're meant to do courses to rehabilitate yourself. But you get given a sentence planning whilst in prison with a load of targets that you've got to achieve before the parole board will even deem you fit for release. But this sentence was abolished 7 years later. It was introduced in 2005. 7 years later, in 2012, it was abolished. And it was abolished because it was deemed inhumane. And Lord Blunket, who created the IPP, gave a statement, and he said he regrets it and it is a disaster, and he's actually campaigning to get stuff done with the IPPs now to try and help the people that are still incarcerated. But there is a lot of people campaigning to get this IPP lifted or get something done with it to give people a chance. There's a group called UNGRIP, which stands for United Group Against IPPs. But out of all of those people serving IPP, there's been 250 deaths. The majority of these are down to suicide, but there's only been 70, well, I'm saying only, there's been a massive, out of the 250, 71 are confirmed suicides. But it's definitely a lot higher, the number. They've been trying to cover it up. The amount of people that have committed suicide, young people as well. There was this lady named Charlotte, who I've mentioned on another podcast. 15 months IPP she got. She served 8 years, and she was diagnosed with a personality disorder. So this lady that was incarcerated, suffering for 8 years when she could have been released in just over 1 year. Because of her personality disorder, she couldn't behave in prison, and she kept getting negative comments, and she tried to kill herself on numerous occasions. She was put on suicide watch, but even whilst on suicide watch, she managed to kill herself, committed suicide because she felt there was no other way out. Now these are the types of scenarios and cases that are happening every single day within the prison system that people don't even hear about. Because when you're doing an IPP sentence, if you keep coming up for parole and getting knocked back because you can't do a course, and the course you can't do it because they don't do it in the prison you're in, or you can't get transported to another prison because there's a waiting list and your parole hearing comes around. But in the meantime, through no fault of your own, you haven't been able to do the course. So what happens when you come up on the parole? The parole board don't take that into consideration. They just say you haven't reduced your risk of reoffending. You're still a danger to the public, so we're keeping you in for another 2 years. So another 2 years goes by, and within that 2 years, maybe you've had a couple of negative comments off the officers, you don't get on with them, or something's happened on the wing, and you've been involved, but nothing serious has happened, but yet you get knocked back again because you've had a negative comment. So these people, I've come across them in the prison system myself. Whilst I was serving my IPP, when I went back in on a recall, I met people that were in there who'd been in for 15 years. And I did question them and say, well, like, how come you've been in for 15 years? You're 8 year over tariff. I used to think to myself, I couldn't understand it myself, but whilst I started talking with them, it was because, like I've just previously mentioned, they couldn't keep themselves out of trouble, i.e. back chatting to the screws, and then coming up for parole hearings and getting knocked back. And this one particular friend of mine, he came up for his parole, got knocked back on 3 occasions. He'd never had any trouble in that 7 or 8 years, it was. And he come up for parole, he got knocked back again, and he couldn't take it no more. His head was mashed, suffering really badly with his mental health, so he turned to drugs, and then he started smoking spice just to get out of it so he could forget about the prison whilst he was out of his head. So when he comes up for parole again, he gets a knockback because he's now on drugs. So these are the situations they're putting people in. They can't get out of this. They're stuck, they feel helpless, and there's just no way out, and a lot of them are just killing themselves. But how can they still keep doing this to people when this sentence has been deemed inhumane and it's been abolished? It's 10 years since this sentence has been abolished, and they're still keeping people in. It's unlawful. It needs rectified. Something needs to be done. But with the IPP, I'll talk about the licence conditions now. Or, sorry, not the conditions. The guidelines. You can apply for your licence termination after 10 years from your first release. So if you've been out of trouble for 10 years since your first release, you can apply to the parole board. You can do it direct yourself, or probation can do it for you. And you can have your licence terminated. The last time I looked, I think there was something like, I'm not quite definite on these statistics, but it was something along the lines of 4 people had actually had the licence terminated. So there is hope for the rest of us that are serving this inhumane sentence. But after 5 years of being in the community without any trouble, you can also have your supervision removed. But again, that's down to probation, and the likelihood of that happening is very slim. But there is hope for the rest of us. But the majority of people back in prison IPP is down to recall. And the most common reason for recall is non-compliance. So if you're not getting on with your probation officer and you get into an argument with her, or you disagree with them, then they can recall you back to prison without even committing an offence. So you can get imprisoned for something that you can't, any normal person can't go get sent to prison for. You can get sent to prison for having an argument with your probation or disagreeing with them. And what happens on a recall? You go back to prison and you've got to wait for the parole board procedures again. And this can take months, years. It's a minimum of 6 months, but it will more than likely take well over a year. So you've got to sit back in prison for a year, and a year on IPP recall feels like 5 years because of the stress you've got to go through and the courses you've got to do with the big backlog. You've got to do it all over again whilst you're back in there, and if you don't behave yourself and you start being cheeky with the officers or whatever in prison, then you're going to get kept in even longer. So it's just an ongoing battle. But this sentence, the IPP, was only brought out in England and Wales. Scotland and Ireland never even introduced the sentence, and this is supposed to be the United Kingdom, Great Britain, where the laws should be the same throughout. If only we had the same laws as Scotland and Ireland, this sentence would never have been introduced. But that's all for now on the IPP, this never-ending sentence. I will be uploading more videos soon, so keep tuned, and if you like the content, please like and subscribe.